Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. We'll get started. We are on a tight schedule today. My name is Dr. Hasan Waheed. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk about the Jinn within and demystifying some of the beliefs around possession. So, with that being said, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. He's a consultant clinical psychologist, a Jungian psychotherapist. He's a chartered psychologist and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. He's been spending many years developing a clinical application of Islamic psychology. He's a visiting professor of clinical psychology at the University of Karachi and has taught on the doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Sheffield, as well as the Cambridge Muslim College. Professor Rasjid Skinner.
Well, thank you, Hasan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum. Right, first slide, I think. Right, we'll be talking about invisible beings and their influence on human psychology. So, oh gosh, now is how to position myself so I don't block the. Yeah. So different names: jinns, poltergeists, fairies, possibly aliens, and a little bit. Well, something about jinn possession, beliefs around it, maybe a little bit about black magic and evil eye. So, belief in these hidden forces that inhabit this world with us, sort of co-inhabit the world, is pretty nigh universal. I don't know of any culture around the world that doesn't have such beliefs. In the Western world, they've been rather cast into the shadows, but they're still there. Certainly when I was in Northern Ireland, you'd still find fairy trees. You know, a fairy tree in England is the hawthorn, associated with fairies living in them and typically on a watercourse. And these sort of fairly common universal beliefs that these creatures live in trees, live in deserted places in particular, and on or in water. So they're certainly in the Celtic fringes, but also in England in country places, you know, people are aware of these forces. And possibly this sort of idea of aliens. There was research a few years ago that showed that 40% of Americans believed in alien abduction, and 10% of Americans believed they had been abducted. Well, it begs the question, why are aliens only interested in abducting Americans and not Yorkshiremen? Well, there could be a reason, but it makes me think this is a cultural manifestation of the same thing that's always been there. So whatever name you call them, and I think Nick will be talking about this later, however these are imaged within the folk culture, you're dealing with the same, I think, universal reality. And I've certainly had experience of jinn, I mean, both clinically, but also, you know, I used to farm in the Yorkshire Dales, and repeatedly, if I were dealing with hawthorn trees, I'd have some sort of trouble. You know, car keys disappearing. The later was my spectacles disappeared. I mean, this is a replacement, there's an old pair I found. They don't send me doolally. Well, I don't think so, Hasan, you're the expert. But, you know, they make their presence felt. You know, that I'm disturbing their home, even though, you know, I observe the adab towards jinn and talk to them first and explain what I'm doing. I did once give a paper on Are Jinn Racist? And this was based on, well, it was based on the observation that English chaps seldom seem to get possessed, whereas other ethnic groups were dropping down like flies with it. Somebody did say, well, that's because English jinn can't be bothered. So they're sort of sitting up in their trees for the last, haven't possessed anybody for the last 300 years and smoking their pipes. Oh, we'll just take his car keys. So I've had experience. Who else has had direct experience of something that seems like Djinn or the equivalent? Want to say what it was?
Yes, I'm from a Hindu background before I was a Muslim, and when I was a child, I distinctly remember going to ceremonies where somebody would just appear to be overtaken by a presence which they would term, the Hindus would term as the godlike being. But to me as a child, it seemed extremely frightening. People who otherwise had their right minds and right senses were suddenly very terrifying looking in their outward appearance. So, and looking at that as through a Muslim lens, I can only think that they were inviting possession.
It has a good point, actually. We'll come on to this whole issue of is possession possible, and if it is, what are the conditions that sort of facilitate it? So come back to me with that example. Anybody else? It can't be only two in the room, surely. Right, well, we'll carry on. As I said, there is a universal belief, I think, about these invisible beings that share our planet with us. But there are cultural variations in how these are perceived, and in particular how negatively or positively they're received. And this goes for within the Muslim world as whether the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. I mean, my experiences in the subcontinent, Jinn tend to be viewed almost always negatively. That's so? Yeah. Right, we'll come to other beliefs, such as in East Africa, where there's a much more benign attitude to Jinn. And in English folklore, you see this. I mean, you get the goblins and the nasty leprechauns and so on, but there's also fairy godmothers and nice elves and so on. So there are cultural variations, and this comes into the psychology in practice. As far as Muslim belief goes, can we cut the noise down a bit? Yeah. It's a canonical belief that Jinn exist. That is, it's in the Qur'an, there are hadith about it. It's only really the extreme Mu'tazilites, the extreme rationalists that try and rationalise this away. But I think generally speaking, we say if you're a Muslim, it's in the Qur'an, seems fairly straightforward. You believe that these beings exist, and that they can interfere in our world, and that they're good, bad, and indifferent. They're not always bad. There's Muslim, Christian Jinn, bad Jinn, good Jinn, much like human beings, people in between. Whether they can possess people is not an Islamic canonical belief. Opinions vary on it. There's nothing absolutely clear-cut, in my view, either in the Quran or the Hadith, that clearly, unambiguously talk about possession. And Muslim scholars have been divided on it. Razi, for instance, believed it wasn't possible. And it's also a sort of Mu'tazilite position that Almighty God would not have allowed an inferior part of his creation to take over a superior part. On the other hand, you're probably aware Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a whole book on Jinn and how to get rid of them and deal with them. So there's a mixture of opinion. In the folk culture, I think there's no doubt, and you'd be aware, that almost not just Muslims, but almost everybody that has a sort of conscious belief in such things believe that some sort of possession is possible. That is, the entity enters you and takes over control of you. Those that say, well, it is possible, and you could even take Razi's position and say, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not allow an inferior part of the creation take over a superior part. The difference, or one aspect of that superiority, is the superiority in akal of the human being, of of intellect. But if the intellect is weak, for whatever reason, including being a child, being drunk, or indeed wanting it, then maybe these things can happen. So these are the circumstances. And bearing this in mind, when we deal with psychological explanations for possession phenomena, it's only a one way of construing it. There can be both more than two ways of trying to explain the same thing. You can say, yes, there is a psychological condition, but because of that psychological condition, the person is weak, so something comes in. And therapeutically, what you're interested in is, what can I treat in this? And particularly, can I treat the fundamental reason for this problem rather than the secondary issue? And I think it's reasonable, if you're in a culture in which belief in these occult hidden forces is common, that if funny things happen to you, either externally or particularly internally, like hearing voices or your body reacting in a strange way, that you would reasonably question whether this is due to an occult force or whether it's due to something else, indigestion. But people need to have the freedom to discuss this. And the service that we operate from Bradford, Ihsan, the Hasan referred to, this is the Islamically based and integrated psychotherapy service. We take these things seriously, and we employ Raki as part of the team, who will be the expert in deciding whether there's something like a Djinn or black magic influence in a case, and if so, is it primary, is this fundamental to the condition, or it's a secondary issue? You still treat it, but it doesn't mean to say you therefore don't also treat the psychological aspect. And indeed, in one case I dealt with, where there was very obvious Djinn activity, which had produced a lot of rows between a married couple, and we brought in a Raki who was also a psychotherapist, and he dealt with the Djinn problem. I mean, I witnessed this. And then he said, but, you need therapy. You've both been traumatised by what you've been through. Plus, you've been saying some pretty nasty things to each other under the sort of influence of this. So, you still need the psychotherapy. Next slide. It's that one, isn't it? Yeah. So these are some myths we'll look at, or constructions, that Muslims and generally other ethnic minorities do not access psychological therapies because of occult beliefs. And our experience in Ihsan is that certainly isn't the case. We don't actually advertise our services because we get more than enough referrals from word of mouth. And we know if we advertised, we'd be absolutely swamped. So the issue is that mainstream psychological services, by and large, don't give people confidence. I mean, psychology is very much a conceptual construction. It's not quite about realities in the same way that physical medicine is. So how you construct, how you understand what you're experiencing varies, and you need to be able to speak to somebody that can share the way that you're understanding what's going on. This is not the only aspect of Islamic psychology. We also will go much deeper into the self and deal with qalb and spiritual issues as well as these things. So that, I'm absolutely certain, is not true. Occult forces do not exist. I would say certainly not from my experience, as I said, both personally and clinically. And occult forces are the main causes of mental illness. My experience is that they're not. They're there. They can cause disturbance in people. Sometimes people's belief about it can be good or bad. It has an influence on your psychology and your mental state, but certainly not. I'm pretty sure it's a main cause of mental illness. But the next, occult forces. Occult in English means hidden, something that's in the dark. So it refers to Djinn and other things that may be around, including black magic. Occult forces do not affect mental state. My experience is they definitely do. The degree to which they do varies. And occult beliefs cannot be incorporated into psychotherapy. I think they can be, and very successfully. But we'll come on to that later. So, next slide. My experience of life is if I press buttons, something goes wrong. I'm grateful for Hasan that...
Professional button pusher today.
So this is a sort of template for how I think the team in Exxon would diagnose what's going on if somebody appears to be or thinks they are under the influence of something like Djinn. And the first thing is it true or is it false? But different from that, is the belief functional or dysfunctional? So how do you think we would diagnose whether it is true? If somebody comes along and says, I think myself, my mother's been influenced by Djinn, what sort of evidence would you look for?
Symptoms.
What symptoms?
So, something they feel sort of painful when the Quran is recited, or they can't pray properly, or they have like an aversion to certain things, or to sort of a distance from beauty, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay, hold that. Anybody else? Any other evidence you'd look for?
And just acutely erratic behaviour, which is in the context of what's happening, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, right, hold that. So it sort of, you can't find a psychological explanation for the phenomenon. So whatever behaviour is going on, whatever they're experiencing, whatever symptoms they're reporting, and so you are a psychotherapist or a psychologist, and you're doing the clerking, the assessment, and you can't find a psychological cause. Yes, I think that's one. Anything else? Okay, for me, the strongest evidence is objective. So it's when I'm actually observing something. For instance, in the case I mentioned where we brought in the Iraqi psychotherapist, I heard the voices coming out of the wall. And, this has happened in Pakistan, and they've come back with them. But I heard it. So I once, this was with somebody, and the temperature in the room would go suddenly down. It'd be quite cold, and the person immediately would change, become rather paranoid. And after less than 5 minutes, temperature would go up, and a perfectly normal conversation. This went on for about 3 hours. Levitation. Certainly Iraqi reports, people, so you can't give a psychological explanation for that. So for me, it's those things that are the strongest evidence. Then not being able to find a psychological explanation, not conclusive, but it makes you look at other alternative interpretations. And then does the ruqya, or whatever, the Catholic priest or wherever you're going to, does the treatment work? Again, it's not conclusive. You have a psychological condition and the attention you get from the Vaki might solve it, but it's indicative. And there's one other thing, and that is whether the presentation is culturally typical or not. So each culture has an idea about what it's like to be possessed by a jinn. And you would know some of them. You're a woman and you're swearing in a deep, growly male voice. You're shrieking every time you hear the azan. Other typical examples from the subcontinent. Think of any? It must be jinn possession. I think the opposite. It's when I get an atypical presentation. Because if something's in the culture, that itself will influence your psychology and produce the symptoms. And you have to remember psychologically, there's what we used to call, and I think it's still more meaningful, conversion hysteria, which is a condition that for psychological reasons, almost any physical symptom can be produced. That includes abnormal strength, it includes voice changes, it can include things like going blind and going paralysed, but the root is always psychological. The mind is incredibly suggestive to these things. So it can appear very strange what you're seeing, but you can often find the psychological root to it. And if it's coming in a typical way, I'm trying to dismiss it. The biggest incidence probably of hysteria, conversion hysteria, was shell shock in the First World War. And the soldiers that went down with it had normally neurological symptoms, paralysis, blindness, all psychologically caused, because at the time, those were the symptoms people recognised as probably physical, but neurology was only just starting. People weren't good at diagnosing it. You couldn't be sure. So those sort of symptoms people often regard as typical of possession, I'm not convinced by, is other things. 5 minutes, right? If it's true, it's the opposite. So there's a psychological explanation. The symptoms are atypical. They're not the common ones in the society. Like this case I saw when the temperature of the room was going down and the person's skin colour changed. That was objective. But it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screaming and swearing or nothing dramatic. It was just a paranoia went into the voice. If it's dysfunctional, why might it be dysfunctional, whether it's true or not, to believe that your problem has a jinn cause to it? Well, you don't get the treatment. Well, it's lots of things, isn't it? One, you can waste a lot of money. I've known people, they go to the local Raki in Bradford, they don't do anything, so they go to one in Birmingham, they end up with a baton, and flying over to baton land, and it's thousands of pounds that are spent. And they may be completely wasted. There's also, of course, you don't get the real problem sorted. We see families like that. Clearly a family problem that's creating, an issue with the children, but nobody's looking at the family dynamics because everybody's, paying attention to the Djinn phenomena. And particularly if black magic seems to be involved, it breaks families apart because it's always the in-laws. And, isn't it? So, if it's wrong, you create a lot of, fuss by this. Okay, so it can be dysfunctional. Even if it's true, it's maybe not always the best way of conceptualising something. But how could it be? It could be true and functional, but also could be false and functional. And this is, I find interesting, that there's no question at all, from particularly anthropological research, that in cultures that have a belief of things like Djinn causing mental illness, there are far less mental health problems. So, a study done a long time ago, when it was still possible to do these studies, with very tightly defined schizophrenia, DSM defined, the prognosis was a third better in societies which believed hearing voices and that sort of thing had to do with Djinn. And one reason is that it's a more benign interpretation than a Western psychiatric one, which is that, your genes are at fault, something wrong with your biochemistry, take these drugs for life and they'll make you fat and end your life 17 years before necessary. That itself has a psychological effect on you. I believe it's a Djinn, anybody can get a Djinn, and I can go to Iraqi for it. Well, society's reaction, your reaction is different. But also, there's a very interesting study done in, actually, Mozambique, not in a Muslim society. I'm talking about regional differences in Jinn belief. In East Africa, both in the non-Muslim and the Muslim parts, a similar sort of study was done in Tanzania and the Swahili belt. Jinn are often seen as much more helpful than they are in the subcontinent. And often they are seen to exist in tribes or clans. And in Mozambique, there's a belief that if you've been traumatized, a particular Djinn, called a Gamba spirit, inhabits you. And in Mozambique, after the Civil War, a lot of people had witnessed horrible atrocities. A lot of women had been raped. And not surprisingly, a lot of people, particularly women, got possessed by a Gamba spirit because of the trauma. There's an understanding of schizophrenia, if you hear voices in this country, that it goes back to childhood trauma. The child can't deal with what's going on, the sexual abuse or whatever, so it splits its mind. One part carries on, normally the other part is getting the abuse. 20 years later, as an adult, that other side begins to break through, often in a voice. You're bad, you've done awful things, and so on. The advantage, and there's a way of dealing with this called voice dialogue, where you speak to the voice. Why are you saying this is bad, that woman's bad, and that sort of thing? In Mozambique, the shaman, or the Raki, if you like, does exactly the same thing, talking to the Gamba spirit. Because it's a belief that this is normal, that the Gamba spirit, the Djinn, is a guardian, a protector, it's good, there's not the same difficulty in talking about what went on than in this society. The Gamba spirit can say, this woman was raped by that man, so he's got to pay compensation or I'm going to repossess him. This woman's brothers were murdered by that tribe. Everybody believes that the shaman can sort of bring about an outward reconciliation. So there's a reference to it, if you like. So coming back to the question, can you use psychotherapy with a Jinn belief? Certainly you can, in principle. How we would do it, say, in our clinics as clinical psychologists is another matter. Certainly you'd have to take the belief seriously, and we might bring in a Raki to do things to avoid us getting sort of professionally wrapped on the knuckles. But whether it's true or not, whether actually it's a Jinn possessing the women in Mozambique or in Muslims in Tanzania, or it's not, it's a visualization, a conceptualization of something which is purely psychological, from a therapeutic point of view, it doesn't matter. So our conclusion is you don't knock it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.